Good day, good day. We are in day 4 of 365, where we're looking into Genesis chapter 12 to chapter 15. And I'll be giving, as usual, a few lessons that stood out for me as I was reading. And before we give the lessons, it would be good perhaps to start with a quick summary from chapter 12 to chapter 15, where we see in chapter 12, God calls Abram to leave his homeland. He promises to make him a great nation, to bless him and bless all the nations through him. So we see Abraham making this journey into Canaan, and eventually he ends up in Egypt because of a famine that took place, where he lies about Sarai, his wife, that she's not his wife, she's his sister. And we see this similar story taking place later on as well in Genesis chapter 20. Then in chapter 13, we see Abram and Lot are separating due to the growing flocks that they had. There's so much wealth that they needed to separate. And we see Lot chooses the fertile area, which looks more green, but it was closer to Sodom. And we also see God reaffirming his promise to give Abraham the land of Canaan, which began in chapter 12. Then we see in chapter 14 that Lot is captured. Why? Because there's these kings, the kings of Sodom, the kings of these different areas in this region, they were at war, and that had Lot ended up being captured. He was not part of the war, but he was just close to the situation. And so he was captured. But we see Abraham, he rescues his nephew Lot. Remember that Lot is a nephew to Abraham, or to Abraham at this point. And in this story, this is where we see this figure called Melchizedek, whom Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Abraham gives a tithe of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. He's a king of Salem and a priest of God Most High. And we also see Abraham refusing to take the rewards from the king of Sodom. Then chapter 15, we see God, he formally establishes his covenant with Abraham, where he's giving a promise of that he will have so many descendants, like the stars in the sky or the sand in the sea. So there's this promise by God that Abraham will be a great nation, and also that he will be given the land that is now in this land of Canaan. So that is the Abrahamic covenant. We mentioned last time that there is these 5 major covenants, where the first was the one with Noah, and the second covenant we see in the Bible is the one with Abraham. But in this covenant, just to explain it out in full before we get into our lessons, is that because typically with a covenant, there's something which is being promised. Because remember that the covenant is like a contract where someone must, one person will keep the end of the deal and another will keep the end of the deal, meaning that there's an agreement, or there's a deal taking place that I'm promising that I will do 1, 2, 3. So with Noah, God promised that he won't end the world through a flood, as well as that seasons will come and go, and there will always be seasons so that people are able to harvest, right? And the sign there was the rainbow. But with Abraham, the promise has to do with we can break down the promises into almost like 4 parts, but maybe even 3 parts. But the one part of the promise is the land. We see this in Genesis chapter 12 as well as in chapter 15, where God promises to give Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. We see that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, where it will be an everlasting possession, right? And then the second thing that we see is that there's a promise of descendants. There's a promise of descendants where God is promising that Abraham will become the father of a great nation with countless descendants, as many as the stars. We see that in Genesis chapter 12, chapter 15, as well as in chapter 17, because God keeps on re-emphasizing or reaffirming his covenant. And then the third blessing or promise that God is making is a blessing of, is a promise of blessing and protection. So God will bless Abraham and will make his name great. He will protect him, and he promises to bless those who bless him and to curse those who curse him. So there's this sense of out of Abraham there'll be nations, and there will be a blessing to the world. And then the sign of the covenant, just as we saw the sign of the covenant with Noah, here we see a sign of the covenant with Abraham having to do with circumcision, which we're going to see in Genesis chapter 17. And circumcision is given as a physical sign of the covenant for Abraham and all male descendants. And that is why circumcision is quite a big deal throughout the scriptures as we read them. Even in the New Testament, they're still speaking about circumcision. And then Abraham has responsibilities like his end of the deal as part of the covenant. And one thing we should mention about covenants is that, God keeps his part regardless of if we keep our part. It's only in a contract where God will say, okay, cool. No, not even God, but if you're having a contract with a human being, when they don't keep their part of the deal, you can withdraw your part of the deal. But a covenant is much more stronger. It's a special type of contract, right? Wherein there's an expectation to keep your end of the deal, even though the other person is not keeping their end of the deal. And one covenant we know of is marriage, right? Marriage is an expectation for the husband to keep their end of the deal, that they will remain faithful to this marriage regardless of the performance of the wife. And in the same way, the wife remaining faithful in this marriage regardless of the performance of the husband. So that is a covenant. It's not just a contract which you can easily walk away from. And as we're saying, that Abraham in this covenant is given some responsibilities, or his end of the deal. The first, most of which are mentioned in chapter 17. But one, Abraham must walk blameless before God. He must obey God and must trust in God's promises. So that's faith and obedience. Number two, circumcision. So Abraham must, and his descendants, they are required to circumcise every male as a sign of the covenant. And we then see this circumcision as a big heritage of the people of God. And number three, exclusive worship, that Abraham is called to worship and follow the one and true God, leaving behind idolatry. No other gods are to be worshipped. So that is just an explanation of the nature of the covenant that God had with Abraham, or what we call the Abrahamic covenant, as we also saw last time, the Noahic covenant, and we also gave the summary. So let me then just go through a few lessons from what I've highlighted as part of today's reading. So the first verse is verse 7 in chapter 12, where verse 7 says, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And called upon the name of the Lord. Like this small phrase, called upon the name of the Lord. We have seen it before when it says that the people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And we know even in the New Testament and throughout that it says that those who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Why? Because when you read in Romans chapter 10, you can only call upon someone who you believe is able to help you. If you're drowning and you're busy calling for help, you can't call someone who can't help you. You're going to call upon someone who you believe is able to help you. And that is where in Romans chapter 10, Paul asks, how are they going to call upon the one that they do not believe? And how are they going to believe if no one has told them, if no one has preached the gospel to them, right? But what I want to mention quickly in these two verses is the nature of altars, in terms of we're seeing how Abraham builds an altar, and is building an altar out of the place where God appeared to him the first time. So it says in verse 7 that God appeared, and as God appears, we see there's this response from Abraham to build an altar, which is a physical contact point to say that he wants to pray or to call upon the name of the Lord. But the first point I want to mention is that God had the initiative. Abraham did not just build an altar, God appeared to him first. Right? Meaning, it's just the dynamic sense of this relationship where we're seeing that God appears first, Abraham builds an altar. Right? But not only that, we see in verse 8 that Abraham moved. So he's moving. Remember that this is a large land, right? He's moving about this land, and as he moves, it's as if he does not want to move away from the presence of God. It says that he pitched his tent, meaning that, okay, this way he's going to sleep, and then he builds an altar. He did not just say, okay, because God appeared to me at that first point of contact, I built an altar there. Therefore, as I move about this land, I won't need to build an altar again. I'll just go back to the first point of contact. Actually, what he does is that as he moves, he seems as if he wants to move with God. He wants to move with the presence of God, and he builds an altar right where he's pitched his tent. And for me, this just carries an interesting lesson to say that we might have our first point of salvation, maybe the first time we had God, or the first time we came to the Lord, maybe we were taught at in some province, in some country. But we might have moved. We might have, maybe as a student, maybe you might have moved from one city to another, maybe as a migrant worker moving from one city to another. When you arrive at that place, you then say that, okay, the only time I'll think about God is when I go back where I started, maybe my home country or my home village. The only time that I'll begin to call upon the name of the Lord, the only time that I'll go to church is when I go back to my home village, not when I'm now part of the city. I think it's a good example for some of us who might be coming from the villages and we come and work in the city. And then the question is, do we then say that even in the city we shall have an altar before God? In our homes, in the flats that we are living in the houses we're living in, are we going to say that actually I can find a church? Actually, I can pray to God even when I'm in the city, right? So we see how Abraham builds an altar as he moved about. Verse 8 says that he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. But he did not just pitch his tent to say he's going to sleep here. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. All right, let me move. So we as we've read the story together in verse 17, we see, having had then the famine, Abraham goes to Egypt. He lies about his wife. And then verse 17 says, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So it's quite interesting. Some few things to observe here is that number one, the first plagues in Egypt did not start with Moses. They started because of Abraham's wife. The first plagues in Egypt did not start because of the great descendants of Abraham in their millions, maybe. When they were in slavery, it actually began right here with Sarai. Meaning that even with just one person, God can plague a people. And this one person is Abraham's wife. God has a covenant with Abraham. God says that whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever curses you will be cursed. So we can see and even value for that matter someone's wife. Like, God cares about marriage. That's one thing we can speak about this. But the one point I'm mentioning is that God so much valued Abraham that he would send plagues, great plagues, because of one person, because of his wife. Great plagues. But the second thing I want to mention is the fact that one man's sin can inflict many people. Because Egypt, and I mean, this plague is coming to the house of Pharaoh. And when you say house, we're not speaking about a 3-bedroom house. We're speaking about a palace. We're speaking about servants and so many people who live in that place. they're now being afflicted because of one man's sin. And I even wonder whose sin was it? Was it Pharaoh's sin of taking Abraham's wife, or was it Abraham's sin of lying about his wife? But what we can see is that there can be greater consequences to more people even when one person sins. And this is reflected in the story of the gospel when we read even in the New Testament how sin came through one man, Adam. And now with the second Adam being Jesus, there's this life that comes. All right, let's move to the next chapter, chapter 13. So I highlighted verse 4. It says, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. So to me, verse 4 seems as if it is pointing us back to the first altar that Abraham built, the one where God had appeared to him first. And Abraham comes back from Egypt. Remember, he went to Egypt because of famine. He comes back from Egypt, and when he arrives here at this original place where he had been, he goes back to the altar, and there he calls upon the name of the Lord. So one point I want to mention is that we never hear Abraham calling upon the name of the Lord when he was in Egypt. Abraham took matters in his own hands when he was in Egypt. He's lying. He's afraid that they'll take his wife, so he lies about her being the sister. He is not actually calling upon the name of the Lord. He's not saying, God, I'm in Egypt. I'm calling upon your name. Save me from them. He lies instead. Number two, he could have actually called upon the name of the Lord while he was still in the land of Canaan, so that he did not even need to go to Egypt. And there's this trend that these people of God, they keep going to Egypt when there's famine, so much so that God had to speak with one of them and say, no, you know what, please don't go to Egypt. I know there's famine, but please don't go to Egypt. We're going to see it soon. But what I want to highlight here is the fact that while he was away from the land that God wants to give him, he did not call upon the name of the Lord. It is only when he came back that he called upon the name of the Lord. That sometimes we can find ourselves outside the place that God wants us to be. When we find ourselves outside being in a community, outside church, outside a community of believers, sometimes we can find ourselves outside that sense of security, and we can get into taking things in our own hands. We forget about God. We forget about his blessings. We don't call upon him. We begin to get into sin. We're lying like Abraham is lying. And yet, you should have been calling upon the name of the Lord. So there's a call for us to come back to the Lord. There's a call for us to come back to community. There's a call for us to come back to the place that God is giving to us. Remember that this is the land that God is giving to Abraham. And for us, that land is our salvation. To come back into salvation, that sometimes, yes, we might fall off and wander away, but we need to be restored and be found in God. It is from here that we will be able to call upon the name of the Lord. So that is verse 4. Now, we see very interesting lessons in verse 9 and 10, where in this story, Abraham and Lot, there's so much that they needed to separate. Verse 9 says, is it not the whole land before us? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. And if you take the right, then I'll go to the left. So we see how Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered. It was more green, right? Everywhere, like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt. Remember, the land of Egypt is the one which they used to go to when they were in famine. And that is what Lot did. He went to that direction. So one thing we can see here is that Lot moved based on what he saw. You know, he walked by sight, not by faith. He walked by sight. So that's one thing that we can remind ourselves of, that, this thing of what you see. I mean, I'm just thinking of Eve. Remember Adam and Eve? So Eve looked at the fruit, in how it was pleasing in its sight. Good. It looked good. So sometimes we get into things because they look good, when in fact they are close to danger. Bear in mind that we're being reminded that this place was close to Sodom. Right? So, do we do things based on sight alone? So that's one thing we can speak about. The second thing we can speak about in verse 9 is just seeing Abraham's grace. We can just appreciate Abraham's grace in that he gives his nephew the opportunity to choose first. And this just, one can learn about a relationship in how we relate with one another, being graceful to one another. In how we see that Abraham is so graceful, he allows his nephew to choose first. But not only is it that he's graceful, I think one thing we can also learn is perhaps Abraham believed in God, in terms of God has already promised him that this land is his anyway, and therefore he doesn't need to be fighting over that which already belongs to him, over that which God has already mentioned that he's going to bless him, he's going to possess this land. So Abraham did not need to fight over this thing. Right? And then I highlighted verse 14 and 15. It says here in verse 14, the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated. So it's as if, yes, God initially from chapter 12 has already mentioned that this land will be yours. But only once Abraham and Lot had separated do we see God giving this land its dimension. Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. So there's a sense that God is speaking this greater blessing. Is mentioning how this land will be his, and is giving him the dimensions of the land. For all the land that you see, I give to you, to your offspring forever. It's as if he's confirming his covenant, is confirming his promise, but he's giving the dimensions of this land. But there's this small statement. It says, after Lot had separated from him. And what I see here, which is just one thing which stands out for me, is the idea that sometimes separation is necessary for us to walk in the blessings that the Lord is giving to us. Sometimes we're not able to see. Lift up your eyes and look where you are. We're not able to see the breadth, the width of what God is doing in our lives because we are not being separated. And we are called to separate from the world. We are called to be separated so that we can clearly walk with God and He can clearly show us what He's giving to us as we relate with the Lord. So the lesson here is the lesson of separation. That after separation, there's this depth of the blessing being mentioned, and God is confirming the word after separation. Lot and Abraham had separated. Now let's continue into chapter 14. So in chapter 14, verse 11, so the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abraham's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So the first point I want to mention here is that Lot was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was impacted by these fights of these different kings, and now he has been taken, right? And it's as if there's this thing of being in the wrong place, in the sense that and I've mentioned it already, that sometimes you are impacted by other people's sin. Sometimes you are captured because of other people's sin. Sometimes you are in trouble because of other people's sin. We are captured. We have been captured because of Adam's sin. Sin and death came through one man, and there's this capturing that took place. And as I think of Lot, I think of us, that we are like Lot. We are now slaves. We are now captured and slaves because of sin that you might not have done it, but it has impacted you. And I've mentioned it already with the case of Abraham when he was in Egypt, how the household of Pharaoh was in trouble with plagues because of one man's sin. That there's always this sense of you are impacted by the community, you are impacted by the greater numbers, even though you might not have done anything directly yourself. All right. And then verse 14, Abraham heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, and what did he do? He led forth his trained men and went in pursuit. So I just see this amazing thing that when we are captured, or when Lot is captured, he's Abraham. For me, I'm just seeing how it's like Jesus coming for us. He comes for us. He comes in pursuit for us now that we have been captured. Right? Yes, we are captured, but he comes for us. So Abraham did not say, but we fought yesterday. But we separated, therefore let me leave him alone. He will reap what he sow. Abraham went for his kinsman. He went for his nephew. Right? And then we see how he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. So it's as if other people benefited. The king of Sodom benefited by now Abraham going to rescue his nephew. Right? And then we see this story of Melchizedek, where Abraham gives a tenth of everything. Some have used this to say that therefore we must give tithe. But one thing that when you read this story, which is clear, is that Abraham was never told to give tithe. He gave it voluntary by himself. And the second thing that we can clearly see is that it was not even a tithe of his own possessions. It was a tithe of the things which came out of the spoils of war, because he had won the battle, and therefore he's giving a tithe of the spoils of war. As a matter of fact, verse 23, so that was verse 20 where we says Abraham gave a tenth of everything, and verse 23 says that I will not take the thread of or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you say I made Abraham rich. So Abraham, not only did he give a tithe of everything, even the 90% that was remaining, he did not care about it. So it's as if Abraham did not care about these spoils of war, because he wanted to be made rich by God alone and not by other people. And then we can learn a lesson that even us, we can remain in God and God alone. All right, let's quickly move to chapter 15. One little small and beautiful verse. And Abraham believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So this is the gospel. This verse is repeated in Romans, is repeated by Paul. Why? Because the righteousness came through believing in God. It did not come through Abraham did so many amazing things. In fact, he was lying at his home here, afraid. God comes to him, and they have this conversation, and Abraham believed that God would be able to give him a son. As God has mentioned, that you'll have an heir, your very own son. Abraham believed God, and to him that was counted as righteousness. So this is just a reminder that we are made right with God by faith. Salvation is a grace, it's a gift which we receive through faith. So by you believing in God, you can be given righteousness. As you believe God, there can be righteousness that you get from God. It was something that was accounted to him. And the last verse that I'll mention, verse 16, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So this is where Abraham is, where God is telling Abraham about his descendants will be, stuck as slaves in Egypt. So it's a prophecy, right, that they'll have 400 years in Egypt, but they'll come back here because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it's as if God is saying that, actually, I won't give you this land until the people who stay in this land do not deserve the land. Why? Because of sin. Meaning that God is a patient God. Imagine 400 years while his own people are stuck in slavery. Why? Because the sin of the current people who own this land, their sin is not yet complete. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And we can really learn of a God who's patient. He patiently waited for the Amorites perhaps to repent. And, their evil reached boiling point. And at that point, that is the only point that God said, now it's time for them to be removed from this land. Now it's time for this land to be taken by the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites. So we can really learn about God's grace and patience. God is so patient with people. He was patient with the Amorites. He was patient with the people who had this land of Canaan, to say that let's wait for them and see if their iniquity will reach its completion. All right, so we can end there today. God indeed bless you.